Good morning and welcome to the final episode of the Algae Filter. As you can see, we've had some success, actually some significant success in eliminating the hair algae in the tank. But I don't really think it's the result of the algae filter. There's been many suggestions as to how to improve that algae filter, and for all intent and purpose at the moment, it's just simply another reservoir waiting to be refugium that has hair algae growing in it. I think what's been effective is a combination of a phosphate reducing media. You can see here that we've added this and had some reduction in its intensity. But really what I think it is a combination of two things. Big water changes where I religiously was trying to suck all that algae off the rock, and even though that didn't really eliminate it, it knocked it down to the point where it was so short that by turning the rocks upside down in the tank, I was able to hide the algae, and at the same time the algae's not getting as much light as it was, so it's really not thriving. Here, take a look here.
As you can see, there's an obvious reduction in the amount of algae left in the tank. Now granted, I've probably hid some of it by turning some of those rocks over, but again, there's a noticeable decrease in the amount of algae still in the tank.
Now, in addition to the algae being gone, 98% of it, which a lot of it could just simply be on the underside of some of those rocks, but the idea being that it's starved of light and hopefully will die off. But the one other thing that becomes noticeable in the tank is, where's the corals? In other words, what happened to those few that were remaining? Has water quality declined to the point where the corals couldn't thrive? Was the addition of the lanthium a problem in the tank? Oddly enough, the anemone, which in this case I wouldn't call it a rose anemone, I think it's a type of bubble anemone, although the two are very closely related, is continuing to do much better. I would say maybe 8 inches across from bottom to top at the moment. And of course that sea-bay or Clark-eye clown just loves it. Interesting point, his partner tends to huddle down in this little tiny green bubble anemone down here in the bottom. That's not really doing all that well. I guess in this case, both of them decided they like the bigger anemone. So we're going to go ahead and service this tank today. I want to talk just a little bit about that algae filter and then the new direction of the tank. So here's our algae filter back here. The light is still working. It's on a timer, and it would go off when the main lights in the tank were on. The idea being that photosynthesis, which occurs whether it be in the algae filter or in the tank, produces oxygen. And as opposed to lights on, lights off, where the tank respirates and at the same time produces, you get this fluctuation in oxygen levels as well as the pH. Since I've got two alternating environments with the lights on, it kind of levels or evens things out. Anyhow, if you take a look here inside the filter, you'll see there's a lot of hair algae growing down inside here. The other thing you'll see is there's no more of that chaeto or keto or whatever you want to call it, that wiry algae, which to me, this was not a favorable environment for it. And to be honest with you, I think I have a hard time believing that this fuzzy hair algae in here is absorbing much of those nutrients, although I am going to take a sample of water with me today and we'll test it once again. There are a few remaining pieces of the chaeto, but nothing of any significance. So I would say this was not a favorable environment, at least for that type of algae. As I mentioned in the very beginning of this series, years ago I had attempted it using a plant called Caulerpa, which now has become very difficult to get a hold of. That at that time resolved my problem. It may or may not have done better here. So at this point, this just simply becomes a waiting to be refugium or a waiting to be taken down, one of the two. I mean, mechanically it worked out well. It never overflowed. There were a few times I got a little concerned about these strainers becoming plugged, and that being the case, the water potentially could have risen over the edge and then spilled down, but with my every 2-week visits here, it worked out well for us. Just didn't do the job it was intended to do.
As with all the various facets of the algae filter and whatever solutions or drops that I've been adding to the aquarium to remove the algae, they've all been coordinated with a regular every 2-week service visit. And that's what we're here for today, is to clean the tank. So we'll go ahead and get our pad on a stick out and start cleaning some of those hard to get spots of algae. We'll also start working on that layer of sand at the front and end of the aquarium, which is always difficult to clean, namely because the amount of sand there increases the likelihood that we're probably going to have some scratches down at that gravel or sand level.
Things that I do believe has been very beneficial is the large water changes. And I don't mean large as in more than 50%. This is a 150-gallon tank, and we're changing out 30 gallons of salt water every 2 weeks. It's a high volume, but it's not enough to become stressful to the inhabitants of the tank. The benefit is those bigger water changes have a greater effect on diluting whatever nutrients are in the system, such as phosphates or nitrates. So in addition to the water change, we've been vacuuming the sand at the bottom of the tank, which can also be a source of nutrients, encouraging all that algae growth.
But before you start vacuuming that sand bed, you have to stop and make a decision. Is your goal to have a living sand bed, one that is basically fluid with a number of different living organisms that all help consume the debris that might settle in that sand? Or is your sand bed or gravel bed simply representation of the bottom of the ocean, and as such would just end up becoming a trap for holding on to uneaten or consumed and defecated food that sits at the bottom, thus adding to the nutrient level in the tank? Well, in our situation, it is simply just a bed that's going to trap debris. So we want to go through and vacuum that debris out of there, which should help lessen, if not the amount of debris that ultimately becomes phosphates, it may even help remove some of the phosphate that's trapped in the gravel itself.
And if you don't think that there's much debris down in that sand, you can clearly see here the amount of stuff that's in the water that I'm siphoning out of the sand.
And in addition to vacuuming the sand or gravel bed, we're also going to devote a portion of the water that we're going to replace in the tank to sucking out some of the algae that's on the rock itself. And we'll simply disconnect the vacuum end of the siphon hose and begin to try to draw some of this loose algae directly off the rocks. And once I get that old dirty water out of the tank, I need to carry it back in. That'll be 30 gallons, 5-gallon jug at a time. So make it a point to come on back for the final actual part of this algae filter episode. And we'll also clue you in as to the new direction of the tank now that we've gotten rid of most of the algae in the tank.